Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we're diving into something that might surprise you, the intricate world of Roman fragrance and the remarkable women who understood that scent was power. Before you continue, if you find these hidden stories of ancient life fascinating, definitely hit that like button and subscribe. It really does help us grow. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love hearing from people all over the world. Now get comfortable, maybe light a candle if you have one nearby, and let's explore together how Roman noblewomen transformed themselves through the invisible art of scent. We're talking about women who knew that beauty wasn't just about what you could see. It was about what people experienced when you walked into a room. It was about the invisible cloud that announced your presence before your voice did. So let's begin with the story of one woman, someone whose name history almost forgot, but whose obsession with fragrance changed how Rome understood luxury itself. Imagine you're standing in the atrium of a wealthy Roman home in the 1st century. The light filters through the peristyle, dust motes dancing in the air. And then she arrives. Not because you see her first, but because you smell her. That intoxicating blend of amber and rose, the green brightness of crushed herbs, something smoky underneath that makes you think of distant lands. This was Livia, not the famous wife of Augustus, but someone like her, a noblewoman whose name we might never know, but whose influence on Roman perfume culture was undeniable. Women like her didn't just apply scents carelessly. They understood fragrance the way musicians understand melody. They composed it. They layered it. They knew that the scent clinging to your finest silk gown was as much a statement as the color of the fabric itself. For a Roman noblewoman of status, perfume wasn't a luxury. It was a language. A way of speaking without words, of claiming space, of declaring taste, wealth, and belonging to a very specific circle. These weren't women who bought a single perfume and wore it day after day. They had collections, entire rooms dedicated to bottles and vials and precious containers holding liquids that cost more than what a servant earned in a year. Slaves worked to create custom blends. Perfumers traveled from Egypt and the eastern provinces specifically to craft signature scents for individual families. A noblewoman of real status had her own signature scent, something so distinctive that people would recognize her by smell alone before she ever came into view. It was the ancient equivalent of branding, except far more intimate and far more powerful. The truth is, Roman society was obsessed with scent. But this obsession didn't come from vanity alone. It came from a very practical understanding of the world they lived in. Rome was crowded, chaotic, and honestly, quite smelly. The streets reeked of waste and animals, and humanity packed too tightly together. The bathhouses, while cleaner than many places, still held the odor of hundreds of bodies. The smell of cooking fires, the smell of unwashed masses. It was all there. So for the wealthy, fragrance became more than decoration. It was escape. It was refinement. It was a barrier between them and the lower classes. When you wore an exquisite perfume, you were saying, "I am not of the common people. I am elevated. I have access to rarities from the ends of the earth." This was important in Roman culture. Status wasn't just displayed through clothing or jewelry. It was worn like an invisible cloak of scent, announcing itself the moment you entered any space. The ingredients themselves told stories of power and wealth. Rose oil from Egypt, extracted through a process so labor-intensive that a small vial represented weeks of work. The blooms had to be carefully selected, fresh roses pressed and crushed, the oils captured and filtered multiple times until they reached the purity required for noble use. not just any rose either. The most prized came from the gardens near Alexandria, cultivated specifically for their fragrance intensity. Saffron from India, more expensive than gold by weight, its deep golden color and warm, spicy aroma making it one of the most coveted ingredients. A noblewoman might use just a touch, perhaps on a particularly important gown worn to a special occasion. Frankincense and myrrh from the Arabian Peninsula arrived through the long trade routes that connected Rome to the distant corners of the known world. These weren't casual imports. These were treasures, each purchase representing serious investment and serious status. Cassia, with its sweet, warming scent. Cinnamon, whose sharp spice was considered almost masculine and was used sparingly, usually blended with softer florals. Violet, which came not fresh from flowers but from the iris root, processed and aged to bring out its deep, powdery sweetness. Amber, that mysterious resin that washed ashore on some distant beach, captured in stone, then carefully warmed and processed to release its rich, underlying sensuality. Lavender from the Mediterranean, grown wild in some regions, but cultivated in specially tended gardens for those wealthy enough to maintain them. Jasmine, that exotic flower with its intoxicating scent, brought from the far reaches of the empire and carefully cultivated in specialized gardens near Rome. Narcissus, expensive and rare, it smells simultaneously sweet and slightly narcotic. Musk from the musk deer, so concentrated and powerful that a single drop could perfume an entire garment, used only by the most elite women who could afford it. These weren't just ingredients. They were evidence of Rome's reach, proof that the empire controlled trade routes and could access the world's most precious botanical treasures. When a noblewoman perfumed her garments with saffron, she was literally wearing proof of Roman dominion over trade. When she chose frankincense, she was displaying knowledge of exotic, distant places. When she used musk, she was announcing that she had access to luxuries so rare that most women could never even hope to own them. Her clothing became a map of the empire's power, a walking advertisement of Rome's reach into the farthest corners of the known world. The women who wore these fragrances understood exactly what message they were sending. Every scent choice was deliberate. Every selection announced her place in the hierarchy, her access to luxury, her understanding of the rules that governed their world. But here's where it gets truly fascinating. These noblewomen didn't just splash perfume on their clothes and move on. They were strategic about application. They understood layering, intensity, how different scents would interact with each other, and with the natural warmth of their bodies. This was taught knowledge, passed from mother to daughter, from slave to apprentice, from famous perfumers to their protégés. The finest silks and linens used for the most expensive garments had to be prepared for perfume with ritualistic care. They would be carefully cleaned, sometimes treated with substances that helped them hold fragrance. Special herb-infused waters that primed the fabric. Then the perfume would be applied. Sometimes it was poured directly onto the fabric, while it hung from hooks in a special chamber dedicated just to fragrance work. Sometimes it was carefully dabbed on using soft cloths, made of the finest materials available. Some women preferred to soak the garment for hours, letting the fabric absorb the fragrance completely, creating something that was not just perfumed on the surface, but thoroughly infused throughout. The most exclusive technique involved applying a solid perfume, an expensive pomade-like substance made by mixing the essential oils with fats and waxes, sometimes with resins that would help the fragrance develop complexity over time. This would be rubbed into the fabric by hand, worked in with care, taking hours of patient labor. creating a fragrance that would last for months, even through wearing and even after washing. Some of these garments would be worn just once or twice and then wrapped carefully in specially treated linens and stored, actually becoming more fragrant over time as the scent developed and deepened, the ingredients melding together into something richer and more sophisticated. The walls of Roman closets were said to smell divine, entire wardrobes infused with fragrance so completely that even clothes that hadn't been worn in months would carry the scent. Visitors to the homes of the truly elite would sometimes ask to visit the closets just to experience the incredible sensory world maintained there. The scent would greet you before you even opened the wooden doors. The room would be a symphony of fragrances, each garment contributing its own note to the overall composition. And different garments had different fragrances. The formal gown worn for imperial audiences might feature a bold, complicated blend of rose and saffron with just a hint of myrrh. The intimate house gown worn at home might be lighter, perhaps just violet and a touch of lavender. The traveling cloak would have been treated with something protective, something that wouldn't fade as quickly from exposure to sun and wind. The gown worn to a dinner with close family might have a warm, slightly spicy fragrance, something intimate and personal. The cloak worn to the marketplace would be treated with stronger scents that would maintain their presence throughout hours of shopping and social interaction. These weren't accidents. These were deliberate choices, reflecting an understanding of how fragrance moved, faded, developed, and how different scents suited different contexts. A master perfumer working for a truly elite family would keep detailed notes about which fragrances worked best, for which occasions, adjusting and refining the formulas over years of careful observation and experimentation. A noblewoman who wore the wrong fragrance to the wrong occasion was immediately marked as tasteless. She might as well have shown up in clothes that didn't fit. The social consequences were real. Imagine being invited to a dinner hosted by the wife of a consul. You arrive in a gown perfumed with cheap, heavily applied floral oil that screams of trying too hard. The other noblewomen, all delicately perfumed with the rarest ingredients applied with restraint and artistry, would have known immediately that you didn't belong to their circle. You would have been watched, whispered about, potentially excluded from future invitations. Scent was that powerful. It was a test, a signal, a way of sorting who really belonged in the highest echelons of Roman society. This is why noblewomen spent so much time and resources on their fragrance collections. It wasn't shallow. It was survival. It was how you maintained your position, how you told the world that you understood the rules, that you had access to the right things, that you deserved respect. The process of creating these fragrances, of infusing them into garments, involved entire teams of people. The attar maker, the person who would create the pure essential oils, the perfumer who would blend these oils into finished fragrances, the dyers who would prepare the fabrics, the enslaved workers who would do much of the physical labor. A single noblewoman might have a half-dozen or more people whose entire job was maintaining her fragrance wardrobe. Her reputation depended on it. In the elite circles of Rome, your fragrance was as important as your face, your name, your family connections. Some noblewomen became so identified with a particular scent that it was simply called by their name. "Oh, that's Alia's fragrance," someone might say, immediately recognizing her presence from across a crowded room. Other women would try to mimic the scent, hiring perfumers to recreate it, never quite achieving the original. The real Alia's fragrance would remain inimitable, a signature that could not be copied, could not be purchased, could only be experienced in her actual presence. Others would commission new blends as their status shifted, creating a fragrance that marked major life transitions. A girl might have a light, innocent scent for her earliest public appearances, something floral and youthful that announced she was available for marriage. As a married woman, she would move to something more complex, more sophisticated, perhaps with amber undertones that signaled her new status. If she became widowed and remarried up, she might commission an entirely new fragrance that announced her elevated status. A woman marrying a wealthy senator would need a fragrance that reflected her new position in the highest circles. She would work closely with the finest perfumer in Rome, spending weeks discussing options, testing combinations, until she found the scent that would become her new identity. The fragrance was your identity in a way that's almost impossible for us to understand today. And if you somehow forgot this, if you were careless about your scent, society had ways of reminding you. A malicious rumor would spread about a noblewoman who had been caught wearing an inferior fragrance. Her social standing would suffer. Marriages could be affected. Business dealings could be jeopardized. It sounds extreme to modern ears, but in Rome, where everything was about hierarchy and display and knowing your place, scent was serious business. The supply chains supporting this fragrance culture were sophisticated and far-reaching. Merchants traveled thousands of miles to bring ingredients to Rome, risking their fortunes, their lives, navigating treacherous sea routes and dangerous overland passages. Ships sailed regularly from Egypt bringing rose oil, shipments that were heavily guarded and insured at astronomical prices. Trade routes through the Arabian Peninsula brought incense, frankincense, and myrrh, controlled by merchants who understood perfectly that they held the key to Roman elite status. Indian traders brought saffron and other spices, goods so valuable that they were sometimes taxed at rates that only the wealthiest could afford. Chinese traders brought exotic ingredients that had traveled the length of the Silk Road specifically for Rome's perfume trade. This wasn't just local commerce. This was international trade on a massive scale, all driven by the demands of Rome's elite women for the finest fragrances. The networks were complex, involving hundreds of intermediaries, each taking their cut, each contributing to the massive prices that made fragrance the luxury it was. The markup was enormous. A merchant who could secure a reliable supply of pure rose oil could become wealthy beyond imagination. Perfumers who could create innovative blends that became fashionable could build reputations that lasted centuries. Some of the most famous perfumers of Rome became household names, their work discussed and admired in the highest circles. The trade in fragrance was economically significant, driving commerce, creating jobs, generating wealth that affected everything from shipping industries to agricultural cultivation to merchant banking. All because Roman noblewomen understood that scent was valuable, that it mattered, that it was worth paying for. Their desires shaped empires. Their preferences drove trade policy. Their demands for fragrance created economic forces that rippled across the known world. Some perfumers became so famous that they were practically celebrities in their own right. Their names were whispered admiringly in elite circles. Women would boast about which perfumer they employed. If a particular noblewoman used fragrances from a specific perfumer, that perfumer's reputation would soar almost immediately. Other women would seek out their work, would demand access to their creations, would offer substantial sums to commission custom blends. They would hire the perfumer for private consultations, spending entire afternoons discussing subtle variations in scent profiles, debating whether a particular blend needed more saffron or less, whether the base of amber was strong enough. the perfumer's social status would rise dramatically. They might be invited to exclusive gatherings, treated with respect normally reserved for senators and military commanders. Some perfumers were given honorary titles, were presented with gifts of property or money, were essentially adopted into noble families that appreciated their genius, because that's essentially what they were. They were artists. They were creating invisible masterpieces that lasted longer than paintings, that touched more senses than sculpture, that influenced perception in ways that were almost impossible to quantify. A great perfumer's work could shape the entire social landscape of Rome, could make certain women famous for their fragrance, could inspire copycat attempts from women desperate to recreate that level of sophistication and status. The equipment used to create these fragrances was surprisingly sophisticated and jealously guarded. Distillation apparatus made from brass and ceramics, custom designed for specific fragrance work. Scales precise enough to measure out ingredients by the smallest fractions. Some scales so sensitive that they could register the weight of a single hair. Vials and bottles made from glass and alabaster, designed specifically to preserve the integrity of expensive oils, to prevent evaporation, to maintain the chemistry of delicate formulas. Some perfumers had entire arcade shops that looked almost like ancient laboratories, filled with tools and ingredients, and the distinctive smell of concentrated botanical essences so thick it could almost be tasted. Storage rooms kept at carefully controlled temperatures, some with special ventilation systems designed to keep certain scents isolated from others. The work was exacting and demanding. A mistake could ruin months of preparation and cost a fortune in wasted ingredients. A perfumer could spend weeks developing a fragrance only to have it spoil due to improper storage or a failed technique. A perfumer had to understand not just how to combine ingredients, but how they would interact over time, which elements would rise to prominence as the fragrance aged, which would fade, how temperature would affect the bala, NEC. Some fragrances needed to sit for weeks or months before they reached their intended complexity, the ingredients melding together, the sharp edges softening, the deeper notes emerging. Others had to be used immediately, or they would degrade, losing their precious aromatic quality. Understanding these subtle chemistries was the mark of a master perfumer, and the noblewomen who employed them became known for having the most sophisticated, most coveted fragrances in their circles. Their fame spread through gossip and admiration, word of mouth more effective than any advertisement could ever be. They would be invited to gatherings, and people would lean in close just to catch the scent of their gowns. Conversations would start because of a fragrance. Introductions would happen because a man wanted to know who was wearing such an intoxicating scent. In some ways, fragrance was the ultimate invisible power. It wasn't something you could easily copy. You couldn't see it the way you could copy the color of a gown or the design of jewelry. You had to actually know the perfumer, had to commission them directly, had to be wealthy enough to pay their prices. This made fragrance one of the most exclusive status markers in Roman society. You literally could not buy the scent of a truly powerful noblewoman unless she wanted you to. And she probably didn't. These fragrances were too valuable, too identifying, too much a part of her personal brand to share. So women who could not afford to commission their own custom scents would try to recreate them, or they would seek out ready-made fragrances that approximated the smell they admired. But everyone knew the difference. Everyone knew that a woman wearing a commercially available fragrance was not in the same circle as a woman wearing a custom blended scent created specifically for her. The difference was obvious, and everyone would know it the moment she walked into a room. The fragrance told the truth about social standing in a way that words never could. You could lie about your wealth, about your connections, about your importance, but you could not lie about your fragrance. It either announced you as elite, or it marked you as someone pretending to be something you were not. This is why noblewomen were so careful. This is why they invested so much. They understood that in Roman society, you were literally defined by the scents you wore, by the garments you infused with fragrance, by the reactions of others when you passed by. A woman with no fragrance, or worse, with cheap or poorly applied fragrance, was a woman signaling that she had no real power, no real access to the world's treasures, no real claim to elite status. And women who had spent their entire lives building that status would never make that mistake. They understood that the invisible was actually the most visible thing of all. It was the first thing people experienced. It was what people remembered long after they forgot what you were wearing. It was your announcement, your introduction, your calling card. And for a Roman noblewoman who understood power and its subtle displays, there was simply nothing more important than controlling the scent that preceded her into every room. The garments themselves, infused with these precious fragrances, me treasured objects. They were not worn lightly. They were not casually tossed aside. Some noblewomen had clothing that was brought out only for the most important occasions. A gown perfumed with rare saffron and the most exclusive rose oil might be worn perhaps 3 times in a year. The rest of the time it would be carefully stored, wrapped in fine linens, placed in cedar chests that helped preserve the fragrance. These garments were investments, heirlooms, sometimes even mentioned in wills. A particularly remarkable gown could be passed down from mother to daughter, the fragrance carefully renewed over generations. Imagine inheriting not just a garment, but the signature scent of your mother or grandmother. The sensory connection to a woman you might never have met would be immediate and powerful. You would smell her in the fabric. You would understand her taste, her status, her place in the world. These heirloom garments were treasured for exactly that reason. They connected you to your family history in a way that was uniquely intimate. The scent would trigger memories. It would create emotional connections. It would remind you of women who had come before you, who had understood the power of fragrance, who had left their mark on the world in the invisible language of scent. So when we talk about Roman noblewomen infusing their finest garments with natural scents, we're not talking about something frivolous or superficial. We're talking about women who understood power at a fundamental level, women who recognized that the invisible was as important as the visible, women who used fragrance as a tool of communication, of status, of identity, women who left no trace except for the lingering scent that announced their presence in any room. And in that subtle, invisible way, they shaped their world and left their mark on history itself. The fragrance would persist long after the woman who wore it was gone. It would cling to the garment, to the fabric, to the memory of those who had stood near her. It would be discussed, admired, copied, coveted, and in that way, the scent of a powerful Roman noblewoman could outlive her, could carry forward her memory, could announce her importance to generations she would never meet. This is the hidden power of fragrance in the ancient world. This is why noblewomen invested so much, why they were so careful, why they understood that scent was not a luxury, but a necessity. It was how you survived. It was how you thrived. It was how you ensured that the world would remember you, would know you belonged, would understand your worth. In the end, a Roman noblewoman's garments, infused with the rarest and most precious natural scents available to her world, were more than just beautiful things to wear. They were declarations. They were weapons. They were the invisible expression of power that shaped everything from social invitations to political influence. And long after her body was gone, long after her face had faded from memory, her scent remained. It lingered in the fabric. It told her story. It announced her importance. It whispered of her power across the centuries. And that, in the end, was what true power always was. Not the visible, but the invisible. Not what could be seen, but what could be felt, remembered, and treasured forever.